Hi, I'm Amy Johnson, and I'm here to teach a class on how to end habits and addictions for good. Some of the things that I want to talk about in today's class are perhaps a little controversial, maybe not so controversial, but kind of new, a little cutting edge, I think. So the approach to ending habits and addictions that we're going to talk about a little bit today is based in neuroscience and some recent kind of brain science research that's out there. Very easy to grasp, so don't turn your computer off when I say neuroscience. Very easy. I'm going to way simplify it so that I can understand it as well. And it's a little bit of neuroscience, and it's also a little bit of spirituality. So some kind of spiritual principles and how those two intersect, and how they kind of come together to help people really see their habits and addictions in a new way that makes them look far less powerful and consuming than perhaps they once did. And just as a little bit of background on this, I use these principles myself. I have used them to get over several habits and addictions myself, and I use them as a professional with clients all the time, and in particular in all kinds of issues. And so we'll talk about habits and addictions across the board. I mean, the basic principles really do kind of apply. One of the areas that I tend to use these a lot in is women with eating disorders, and men as well. It just happens to be mostly women, but um, men and women with especially binge eating disorder, these principles are really excellent for that. But again, they apply to pretty much any habit or addiction you can imagine. And so as you're listening to the class today, see if you can um, just kind of listen in a really easy way. So we're going to talk about the 10 big ideas. You know the format for all of these classes, and that's going to be really helpful. It's a great format. But as you're listening to these 10 ideas, just sort of let them kind of land somewhere with you. I know that's a very vague instruction, but kind of watch as if you're watching a movie. Just pretend like I'm just some, YouTube video that's very casual, that isn't about something you need to try to understand with your intellect. It's not about something you need to take notes on or grasp necessarily. Just kind of listen softly and see what stands out to you. So with that, let's talk a little bit about the top 10 big ideas for ending habits and addictions. The first big idea is what I've called, it's not you, it's your brain. So there's a really popular book actually by Jeffrey Schwartz called something along those lines. You Are Not Your Brain, I think is what he calls it. And it's sort of this idea that, habits and addictions and things that any behavioral action, any thought, even persistent thought that we find coming up over and over again isn't really us in a sense. It's our brain. So I use this analogy of your finger. Like if you cut your finger, you would just allow your finger to heal. It wouldn't be personal. You wouldn't take it really personally. You wouldn't think that you need to get into therapy to figure out why you cut your finger. It wouldn't necessarily change your life. Maybe while the cut's there, it might alter your life a little bit. But once it's healed, especially, it's just done. It's just a finger. It's not that big a deal. And, thinking about habits and addictions in a similar way can be really helpful in that it's just our brain. It's what our brain is conditioned to do. Brains pick up habits, they pick up patterns, they do things that make sense on some level to the brain. And even when those are things that we really wish we weren't doing or things we would do anything to change, it can be really, really helpful to kind of contain this habit or addiction that you might have to your brain and say, this is just something that's kind of, it's a feedback loop. It's something kind of going on in my brain. And it's an issue that concerns one particular organ in my body, and that's it. And it doesn't determine who I am, and it doesn't speak volumes about my past or my emotional life or my weaknesses or my strengths or any of that. It's simply what an organ in your body is doing. Just like if you cut your finger might be bleeding. That kind of approach, and especially as big idea number one, to kind of ease into this with that as sort of a guiding principle is super helpful, because it really helps you to see if you can step away from maybe not making things so personal, and seeing this as a really impersonal, whatever your habit is, it's a really impersonal, in a sense, brain wiring issue. So if can't get off Facebook, or you are a gambler, or you have persistent fears about speaking in public, let's say, those don't speak to your character necessarily. Just play along with me here. Perhaps they don't speak to your character. Perhaps they don't, they weren't dictated by something bad that happened to you in the past. They're simply what your brain has sort of conditioned itself or trained itself to do. So big idea number 2 is that the part of your brain that represents this habit that you might have, the part of your brain where the habit sort of lives, is different from the part of the brain that acts on the habit. So we're going to completely simplify the brain, like way oversimplified. Please don't ever hold me to this. But let's just pretend like your brain has 2 main parts, a higher and a lower part. Very oversimplified. Obviously, there's tons of stuff within each of those. But the lower brain in general tends to be the part of the brain that is older. It is lower when you look at kind of where they sit. It is lower. It's kind of by the brainstem. It is older. It's the part of the brain that people refer to as the reptilian brain or the animal brain, because even reptiles and animals have that part of the brain in common with us humans. And so it's a very primitive part of the brain. And that part of the brain is all about finding patterns and seeking out kind of consistency. So it kind of globs on to like anything that's done over and over, and it kind of looks for those things in your life, and it'll kind of play out patterns and play out habits. And so for a lot of reasons, you can see that part of the brain is very involved in where our habits, our habitual behaviors, and our habitual thoughts kind of reside, in a sense, in the brain. That lower brain also has a lot to do with survival. So this is unfortunate when it comes to habits and addictions, because the lower brain also is the part of the brain that kind of keeps us alive, which is wonderful, and it has the whole fight or flight thing going on. So it alerts you when there's a danger, and it kicks your instincts in for you to help you kind of get out of the way of danger. And so it's all kind of geared about doing things habitually and consistently to kind of keep you safe. And what happens, in a sense, is that when you pick up some habit, let's just use the Facebook habit, for example. Let's say you're constantly, stopping work and going on Facebook and wasting hours there that you don't want to be wasting. So when you pick up this habit, your brain kind of says, ooh, she really likes Facebook. Let's give her some more Facebook. Go back to Facebook. It kind of picks that up, and it gets a little confused because there's this whole survival thing going on. And in a sense, it kind of acts as if Facebook is essential to your survival. In part because you're very innocently teaching it that, because you go there so much. And when you go there, you like it. When you go there, your brain gets happy chemicals. And again, we're way oversimplifying. Your brain gets happy when you go there. And so the lower brain says, ooh, Facebook makes her happy. Let's have her keep going back there then. This is a good thing. And so it kind of keeps it alive. So that's the lower brain in a nutshell. The higher brain, this other part of the brain, is the part that's responsible for decision making, and it moves your muscles in a voluntary way, and it does all the kind of higher order things. So reptiles don't have a higher brain like we do. So this is unique to humans, and it makes us think, and it makes us rational and logical decision making creatures. So the higher brain is the thing that would actually be responsible for you going to Facebook. It would have you type in facebook.com. It would have you, moving your mouse and doing those things. And it would have you make the decision. That's where you make the decision to do that, even when it doesn't feel like a decision. If it's kind of a big habit, there is a decision on some level, and that comes from the higher brain. So the important part of all of this brain talk is to see that the lower brain is where your habit lives. That's the part that's kind of speaking to you and urging you to do your habit more and more. But the higher brain is the part that has to obey the lower brain. And this is going to come up more as we keep talking, but just to kind of keep it at that level right now. It's 2 different parts of the brain, right? So you can get the urge, but there's another part that has to make a decision to follow through on that urge. And so they kind of have to interplay there a little bit. So the third big idea is that your habit is only alive because you have these urges. So the lower brain thinks, it's all about your survival and keeping you alive and keeping you happy and keeping things good, keeping the status quo. So the lower brain says, "Ooh, let's give her, let's like make her go back to Facebook more because she really seems to like that." So it gives you sort of what we would think of as an urge or a craving or a drive to do your habit. And it's the same, again, we can use this with any habit. So if you're a smoker or a drinker or anything, it's that sometimes very, very physical urge. It takes over your entire body. It feels very physical, very emotional, very real. And, um, and it creates this tension within you to do your thing, to do your habit. Now, obeying that urge, again, is the job of the higher brain. The lower brain just spits the urges out. It's powerless to act on them. It can't do a thing about them. It really can't. I mean, all it does is just spit out and broadcast these urges. The higher brain is responsible for your muscles, remember? So the higher brain has to light the cigarette or take the drink or open the laptop. So in a sense, what you're kind of starting to see here is that you can experience an urge that your lower brain is giving you, and your higher brain has to actually make it happen. But if you don't want to make it happen anymore because you want to stop your habit or addiction, a big step toward that is kind of seeing, okay, this isn't the same thing. Like this urge, I don't have to act on this. It's there, and it's this lower brain that's a non-thinking, non-rational part of my brain. But the thinking me would have to make the decision to give into it. So maybe you make that decision, maybe you don't. But this is an important kind of piece of this puzzle. So the only reason that you have a habit is because over time you've experienced urges, and it has occurred to you that the only way to get rid of those awful urges is to just do the thing. So you really want a cigarette. It doesn't seem like you're just going to go for a walk and that's going to do the trick. No, you need to have a cigarette. And you've sort of taught your brain that that's how you will get rid of your urges. But we're going to talk about an alternative. So big idea number 4 is that urges fade. And this is really important. So listen up on this one. An urge is something, again, that the lower brain spits out to keep your habit going, because the lower brain thinks that, your habit makes you happy and it's essential to your survival. And so it does what it can to keep that habit going. So it gives you these strong urges. And the thing about an urge is essentially just a thought. And now you might be saying, like, no, I feel my urges and I like get the shakes that I get, I can't see straight. And that's absolutely true. Our thinking, our thoughts create all kinds of physical responses in our bodies. They create emotion. I mean, thoughts drive people to do everything we do, essentially. So it's not like just a thought, like, oh, just ignore that. I mean, thoughts can be really powerful in a sense. But it's still true that an urge is a thought. An urge is a thought that the lower brain spits out. And what is also true of all thought is that it's temporary. Every thought that ever arises into our mind, it's a constant ebb and flow of thinking. It comes and it goes. It comes and it goes. Now, some of our thoughts feel like they stay around a lot longer than others. And certainly when we are, afraid of them, or we're like, cursing them and things like that, they do stay around longer because we're giving them a lot of attention. We're sort of fueling the fire. And so, it doesn't always feel like our thinking is coming and going, flowing like a river and all of these like peaceful metaphors, but they still are. Like, that's the nature of thought. Whether that's your experience at all times or not, that only makes you human if it doesn't feel like that. And so urges, given that they're just a thought, they will come and go. Now, there are different ways that we can sort of relate to our urges that affect how they come and go. Again, when you have an urge and you say, oh my gosh, I want another cigarette, this is horrible, this is never going to go away, that's kind of fueling the fire a little bit. When you have an urge for a cigarette or to go on Facebook or have a drink and you say, this is my lower brain. This is like a reflex. This is like a blip from the lower brain. That's what it does. It's not personal. It doesn't mean anything. It's just, this is what my brain is conditioned to do. Kind of like your alarm clock going off. It's conditioned to go off because you set it to go off, so it's going to go off. But if you kind of just see it as, okay, this is just what my lower brain does, it becomes much easier to not jump into action on that. And then what you find is that because an urge is just a thought, it fades. And you don't have to do your habit to make the urge fade. The urge will always, 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 always fade on its own at some point. So the 5th big idea is that willpower is the wrong tool. So let's talk for a minute about willpower. taken a little step backward from kind of what we've been talking about here, but it's really important to put in at this point because, the way that most people naturally, just what we've learned, the way that we kind of deal with habits and addictions is by using willpower or discipline or white knuckling our way through or quitting cold turkey or something along those lines. And certainly that works sometimes for some people. So it's not that that would never work. The thing with willpower, though, if we look at this, we're saying that essentially the problem that's keeping your habit or addiction alive is that you have this thought, this urge thought that looks and feels very compelling. And because it looks and feels very compelling, you tend to act on it, right? You tend to light up when it tells you to, in a sense. You do what it says. That's sort of the problem in this perspective. Now, what willpower does, willpower is kind of adding more thought to the whole mix. So willpower would be like you have the thought, oh, you should see if anything, there's anything new on Facebook right now. And you don't want to do that. It's not, you don't want to do it because that's your habit. You want to keep working. And so willpower would add more thought that says, no, you don't need Facebook. Come on, you're stronger than that. Oh, just forget about it. Just go do something else. It would be like that. It sounds like the kid, basically, like the teenager, like the bully. It's like on your shoulder. Oh, no, you don't need that. So it's more thought added to the mix. And that gets a little bit confusing, and it makes your head kind of crowded, and it really kind of makes your head want to explode in a sense. And it really kind of makes you want to just do your habit to shut it all up sometimes because it just adds, so much to what's going on already. So rather than kind of talking yourself up with more thought, what tends to be really wonderful is to just see it all as thought and see that you don't need to necessarily give yourself the pep talk, but when you see that thing that's threatening to derail you, that urge, it's just thought in and of itself, and it's temporary. It's not going to be there forever. It's going to come and it's going to go. And it's just coming from the lower brain, which is powerless to act on it anyway. Unless you make a decision to act on that thought, it's not going to happen. You will not act on it. You will not keep your habit alive that way. When you see that, it's almost like an easier way of dealing with it because you're kind of just stripping away. The problem is all this extraneous stuff. So rather than adding more extraneous stuff in the form of willpower, let's just strip away. And then you get to kind of the piece that's underneath that. So the sixth big idea is about triggers and circumstances. And, anyone who's been, especially in any kind of therapy or done any real, even read self-help books, done any kind of real work on their habit or addiction, has probably been guided to look for triggers at some point. Like what makes you do, when do you really want Facebook? When do you really want that drink? And it's pointing us toward the external circumstances, the things outside that, like when it's Saturday night, I really want to drink, or when I'm bored at work, I really want Facebook. And in a sense, it kind of conditions us. It really just points us in the wrong direction, actually. It's inaccurate because it looks at the outside circumstances as if they cause the feeling. And it's not to say that sometimes they don't. So yes, perhaps if you have a drinking problem, you have urges to drink more often on Saturday night. That very well could be the truth. But what's also true is that there are probably Saturday nights when you don't. And there are probably Monday nights when you do. And by pointing out toward the external circumstances and using that as sort of the big guide here, we kind of lose track of what's real, what's really important, which is the nature of that urge to begin with. So rather than kind of looking at triggers and circumstances and looking outside of ourselves, it's much easier, much simpler to kind of just get to the core of the issue, which is looking at the nature of those urges. The only thing that keeps our habit alive is the fact that when we have an urge to do it, we give in. If we could have urges to do our thing, whatever our thing, you have that Facebook urge, you have that cigarette urge, you say, oh, that's my lower brain. Okay, I'm going to let that die out right now. And it really does fade away because that's truly what will happen. Pretty soon you don't have a habit or an addiction anymore. And you don't ever have to change your outside life to make that happen. It doesn't have to depend on external circumstances. Now, that's not to say it isn't sometimes helpful to change circumstances. So long ago, I used to smoke, and certainly as I was stopping, I quit going to bars with my friends that smoked all the time, at least for a short period of time. I mean, that just made good sense, right? That was common sense in the moment. But I didn't have to like swear it off forever. I mean, once I stopped acting on my urge to have a cigarette, that urge started to kind of retreat and fade, and it didn't come around so much anymore. And then I could go back to being around smokers if I wanted to, and it really wasn't an issue. So, you may want to avoid situations. That's just follow your common sense there. But it's not about avoiding situations and triggers. It's about seeing the truth about that urge, seeing it as a fleeting thought, a very emotional one sometimes, a very physical one sometimes, but nonetheless, a fleeting thought that if you do not act on it, it will retreat and leave you alone. Big idea number 7 is that this may take some practice. So it's extremely simple, extremely simple. You notice that your urges are coming from the lower brain. You do nothing. You dismiss them as just junk from the lower brain, and they go away. It's that simple. But it takes some practice because brains are very efficient, especially that lower brain. Remember, it's all about the patterns and the habits and, keeping things status quo. And although the brain is remarkable in how much it can change, it doesn't necessarily like to change because it likes efficiency. It likes what it knows. So once you sort of innocently teach it something, you condition it to do something, it's going to want to have you keep doing that for a little bit. So, there are times as you're changing a habit that you may dismiss your urge to go to Facebook in the middle of a work day, and you dismiss it 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times, and it stops coming around so much. And next thing you know, it's a few weeks later, and you don't even visit Facebook that much anymore, and it's awesome. Yay, my habit's gone. And then the next day, suddenly you get hit from out of nowhere with this gigantic urge to go to Facebook all day. It's okay. That's just what brains do. Your brain, it's extinguishing the habit. I think the point in this is we don't want you to think of it as an on-off switch. It's not like you have this habit, you have this addiction, or you don't. In this perspective anyway, it's more that you're kind of teaching your brain a new way. So it may take some practice. Big idea number 8, kind of related to this, is about setbacks. So there's a really great chance that you're going to have a setback. This is kind of the issue in a lot of, again, whatever works for people is wonderful, but there are a lot of ways methods for getting rid of habits and addictions that have you kind of counting the days and tracking things in that way. And again, that can be helpful for some people. I'm sure it's encouraging for some people, but it also sort of gets you in this mindset of, if I'm on day 8 and day 9, I fall off the wagon, then I have to go back to day 1, and that really sucks. No one wants to go back to day 1 after you've made it 8 days. And so perhaps you just take it off the table, because here's the thing, a setback doesn't really matter, because we're not going for 100% yes you do it or 100% no you don't. You're just kind of gradually changing your brain. So if 10 days out you start finding yourself on Facebook again, you notice it, you notice the urge, you dismiss the urge, and you're right back to where you were. I've seen so many people doing excellent in getting rid of habits and addictions, really, really good for long periods of time, and then they fall back into it for a few days, and it would be absolutely nothing except that they make it this gigantic deal. They tell themselves, I knew I couldn't do it. This is way harder than I thought. Now I'm back at square one. All that stuff that we tell ourselves is the sole problem with the setback. If you don't tell yourself that, it doesn't matter. Big idea number 9 is that it's much simpler than you might think. And so again, this is a little bit of kind of wrapping it up. Like, just to keep this pointing us toward the whole idea here is that your lower brain puts out these urges because it wants to keep your habit alive. It thinks your addiction is serving you in some way. Your lower brain is powerless. They call it the animal brain, the reptilian brain, because animals and reptiles have this part of the brain as well. So I always picture it as like this lizard, this like reptile in your brain. And honestly, it's a lizard with no arms and no legs, but a really big mouth. And all this thing can do is scream at you. And that truly sometimes, in some of these addictions and habits, that's what it feels like. It's like there's a part of your brain screaming at you to do it, right? Do the thing, light up the cigarette, have the drink, go to Facebook. So you're going to hear that. It's annoying, but you have to remember it's a legless, armless lizard screaming that at you. It cannot do a thing. All it can do is annoy you. All it can do is scream. It's your higher brain, which is you as a human being, that has to decide whether you're going to let a legless, armless lizard boss you around or not. And when you say, "Oh, it's just this lizard," I set this alarm a long time ago, so it's going off. It's not personal. It's just what I conditioned my brain to do innocently. Then it's much, much easier to dismiss. And so when you're able to dismiss that, again, those urges fade. They do fade in time. You don't have to feed your habit to get them to go away. They fade because everything fades in time. And after a while, you find that the lizard just kind of gives up, because why would he keep screaming at you if you're not listening to him anymore? So kind of, it really is much simpler than you think. It's not about triggers. You don't need years of therapy. And I'm not just saying this. Like, again, I've broken many of my own pretty severe habits and addictions this way, and I've seen hundreds of clients do the same thing. And it's a really amazing approach, and fast and relatively easy, and awesome. And so big idea number 10 is that the change from this approach, when you do it this way, is super sustainable for a few reasons. One, you've looked at the truth. You haven't just, avoided some triggers. You haven't just like quit hanging out with those smoker friends. You can do what you want. You can find yourself in any situation in life, because the core of the issue is just this urge that comes up, and you know the truth about that urge. It's just that lizard. You don't have to listen to that. You don't have to give in to that. So you kind of, we strip it down to what it really is, and that means you can go live your life. You can still be stressed out. You can still have a bad day, and it won't mean that you fall back into your habit necessarily, which is really good news. So that's one way that it's sustainable. Another way it's sustainable is that a lot of research shows that this literally physically changes your brain, and we know that by brain scans. And so someone's brain, we will scan the brain of an addict. Well, I don't, but other scientists that do that do. They scan their brain, and they get pictures of it, and they can show, here's, it's lit up right here. Here's when you were having that huge urge, and your habit addiction was really strong. And they show that when that urge is really activated and people just dismiss it, they just don't act on it, they don't keep feeding it, they see it in a new way that allows them to dismiss it, after not that much time, a relatively short period of time, they scan the brain again and they see that it's changed. And after a little bit longer, they see that the brain shows no sign of ever having had that habit or addiction. So, I mean, this is like, it's real. The only way your habit or addiction would live on is in your memory of it. And I wouldn't recommend that you go back to those memories a whole lot. I would recommend you let it be gone. And that really is what will happen. So I hope this has been helpful, maybe shed some light. I know it's a very quick overview of a kind of big thing, but there's always more information to be found on this, and hopefully this has kind of given you a new perspective or a new kind of way of thinking about your habits and addictions that makes them feel a little more hopeful than perhaps they felt before.